I'd like to welcome you all to the Mildura campus of La Trobe University, and a special welcome to the member for Mildura, Ali Cupper MP, the Mayor, Simon Clements, councillors and distinguished guests, one and all. My role at La Trobe is to oversee the development and implementation of the university's regional strategy. We attempt to make sure that La Trobe gains full benefit from its presence in the regions, and that the regions gain full benefit from the presence of La Trobe. And events like this are an opportunity to take that process forward. Now, tonight's topic, called Dried Out, the Future of Inland Cities, will be exploring what is in store for Australia's regional centres in the face of social, economic and environmental changes. We will have tonight, I'm told in my notes, some frank discussions, not wanting to set too many expectations for the panel, about what it takes to keep our country's smaller communities strong as politicians grapple with climate change, social challenges and city-centric policy making, something that as a university operating in a regional environment we know something about. We're also looking at the role that universities can play in regional towns and how can universities enhance their support for inland cities to overcome the economic and social challenges they face. So, on tonight's panel we have Mick Keogh. Mick, do you want to, there we go. He's the Deputy Chair of the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission, has a long and diverse history of involvement with the agricultural sector, including as the Executive Director of the Australian Farm Institute, which carries out independent research into policy issues that impact Australian agriculture. He was also appointed Chairperson of the Australian Government Panel, which reviewed drought support measures, and was the Chairman of the Australian Government's National Rural Advisory Council from 2012 to 2015. To his right is farm innovator Emma Germano. Those of you who have attended our Women in Leadership events in the past might have met Emma before. She's the Vice President these days of the Victorian Farmers Federation and runs her family's mixed farming operation, I Love Farms. That company's focus is on sustainability and connecting farmers with consumers to increase their understanding of food production processes. In November 2016, Emma launched a mobile app called Hello Farmer that assists farmers to recruit and induct farm labour while encouraging farm employment best practice. And again, those of you who've been to Women in Leadership with Emma know that she's not short of opinions, and we look forward to hearing them tonight, Emma. Our third panellist, second right, as you look at it, is Julie Rudner, Dr. Julie Rudner. Julie is a member of our planning team at La Trobe. Her research explores the interaction between policy, place and people, in particular how young people and different ethno-cultural communities use, view and experience their environments. Julie's main interest is on how we influence people's use of public spaces by actively creating an understanding of risk, safety and belonging. She also supports active citizenship through community participation in planning. And completing our panel, nearest to me, is Mildura business leader and community advocate Ross Lake. Ross is Mildura based and is the managing director of Tasco Petroleum, as well as being a wine grower and arts supporter. Ross is also the independent chair of the Northern Mallee Integrated Water Management, a collaboration of peak bodies involved in the water cycle in our local region. And sitting in the middle and keeping them all honest and facilitating our conversation tonight is journalist and author Jack Marks. Please join me in welcoming the panel.
Okay, we'll get right to it. I would be a pretty poor moderator if I didn't start the proceedings with the obligatory obscure quote from a German philosopher. But we don't have that. Instead, I've got a pretty reasonable English early 20th century planner who wrote a book called The City in History, which is, if I'm not mistaken, something of a cornerstone text in planning.
That's right.
He makes the point, sorry?
And a thick one.
Yeah, it is a big one, heavy read. But Lewis Mumford makes the point that among the early hunters and gatherers, that walked the earth all that time ago. The first people to settle in one place and have a coherent nature were, in fact, the dead. The cemetery, he said, the city of the dead is the forerunner of every modern living city. Urban life spans the historic space between the earliest burial ground for dawn man and the final cemetery, the necropolis, in which one civilization after another has met its end. So, with that cheery opening gambit, I'll start with you, Ross. In the popular mind, I guess, or a popular imagination, there's two competing dystopian futures out there for us. The first has the regional areas and inland areas becoming uninhabitable Dust Bowl wastelands, and all of us descending on the cities like so many pigeons waiting for crumbs to fall from the tables of the rich. The other one,
the shopping will be better.
Yeah, the other one is the sea levels rise, the cities go to hell, break down, and everyone leads an exodus into the country. Which one of those two do you think is most likely, or is there a third?
Well, I would always plumb for the third. I suspect the mess will be somewhere in between. We're only 30 metres above sea level here, and 30 million years ago, we were in fact under it. So I'm not sure about how whether we'll be here. It's disturbing that sort of dystopia is put forward, because I'd prefer to look on the positives of regional living, and not only that, look for answers to avoiding either dystopia. And I suspect that there's plenty of answers if we start generating ideas rather than ideology. And that's one of my principal distresses at the moment in the debate. I'm part of the sort of exhausted majority, I guess, who pedals hard every day to ensure that the cohesive social structures that we've got continue to exist, and I think we often dismiss them too readily as dysfunctional, because it is a lucky country. Anyone who's done any travel will quickly agree with me there. So I'll plug for something in the middle with a whole series of challenges that hopefully we're smart enough to conquer.
And do you think the media has a bit of a role to play in the
No, we need to get
in the mental terrorism that's going on with regards to climate and everything?
Well, everyone will want to talk about water here today, I'm sure. I think there's three. In my world, it's about root cause analysis. So in my world, it's not constantly griping about the symptoms. It's actually going and finding out what's causing those symptoms. So I think we've got three fundamental causes of all of the symptoms that worry us across all the forums, whether it's education, infrastructure, water, whatever it is we're having a 140 character tweet about today, or whacking on Facebook, and neither of those things which I do. I think we've got a fundamental failure in this country of federalism, and so many of our problems relate to that fundamental failure. We've got the inexorable march of capital. And if you understand what I mean by that, we've got far too much capital seeking unreasonable returns, washing around the world. And everywhere it lands, it causes dysfunction. And for those of you who know the texts that that I'd recommend, go and read Thomas Piketty's Capital, and go and read Naomi Klein's books. They're excellent. And I think the other thing that we've got is a failure to give value to agricultural commodity. And part of that value we've robbed when we've turned water into a medium of exchange, for example, rather than a social good. So I'm going to plumb for some ideas and some the mess getting cleaned up sufficiently.
Mick, if you don't mind me asking, you rather pointedly, how much or what degree of blame do government and government agencies have to take for the mess we are supposedly in or heading towards at a fast speed? Is it not, I'm sure you will say, we're the voters, we're driving the bus?
Yeah, well, I was going to question you about the mess we're heading towards. I'm not absolutely convinced of that at the moment. I mean, I suppose we do have the luxury of being, I think it's the only country in the world that's had 28 successive years of economic growth and continuing. And yes, I know that that will lead straight to a discussion about distribution of that growth or wealth. Governments in our model have a nudge role and to some respects a limited role, but they don't have a determinative role in many respects. A lot of the issues that we face are driven by, and I know you'll foreshadow that, driven by the decisions we make every day. We've all got mobile phones, we all shop online, we all want cars that do all sorts of things, we all want access to entertainment and screens and all those sorts of conveniences, if you want to put it that way, that come with modern society, and those choices have impacts. So I don't know that I don't know government or many individuals will turn those choices around. So I think the challenges for policymakers and individuals alike are how to accept that reality and then work out what bits can be changed, what bits can be affected by decisions that are made.
Right.
Rather than railing against the machine, I guess.
Right, well, if it's not the forces of government, it must be the planners' fault, Julie. I mean, we blame the planners for everything, don't we? If there's a traffic snarl, if there's an ugly building, if the weather's bad, you shouldn't have put the town under the cloud, you know. What can planning do and what can it not do?
It's an interesting question because planning is a part of every part of our lives through policy in everything beyond just the urban and the physical environment. You know, you mix it with history and archaeology and you have a heritage planner. You mix it with people doing sports facilities management, you have a recreational planner. So in many ways, all of us in our own ways are planning in terms of how we contribute. For the everyday city, town, regional planning, yes, we get blamed, usually when things go wrong or when something we don't like happens. But there's a whole other group of people who might actually be wanting a certain outcome who support those decisions. So planners are the experts in mediating and negotiating those various interests. But when things go fine, when you can grab a taxi and get here on time, those sorts of things show that planning does work. Because it's unremarkable when it works. We just take it for granted. If you look at a different place like the Philippines, where driving 10 kilometers to the airport can take either 40 minutes or 5 hours, depending on the time of day, it tells you, yes, we are a lucky country within that. But within that planning, it's more of a governance structure. Government can't do it on its own. It has to be able to communicate very well, and planners communicate very well to bring communities with them to an outcome. And sometimes planners are behind in their thinking strategically, sometimes they're ahead, and it's about how we massage that to move forward. So planners often play a very background, subtle, but very continuous role, but at times they can also be destructive, depending on either the power that they have in a community or the legislation. If the legislation hasn't caught up, because there's a lot of practitioners who are trying to change the legislation to meet our future desires and needs and also to protect us, but aren't always able to.
And of course, a lot of the planning in the last 20 years has been taken out of the hands of the local, from the local level, and has been planned by remote control from somewhere a long way away.
Well,
isn't that true?
Victoria, yeah.
There's a lot of people in the room who want to tell the horror story of the C89 at this point in this community, which prohibits in the pump districts effectively building a house on anything under 10 hectares. It's 10 hectares, one of the councillors can correct me. The promulgation of that particular planning, not place-based, coming straight out of Spring Street, probably robbed this community of $300 million of value. But more importantly, it destroyed a capacity to exercise some social cohesion. And what I mean by that, it destroyed, for example, if I wanted to build a house for my ageing mother next door or for my son next door, well, that'd be highly unlikely in my son's case, but some people out there know him, obviously. It can't be done. And I don't think that any central urban-based government should tell us that we should be preserving a dying or struggling or distressed agricultural environment for when they choose to be tourists in our community. Now, that's a particular distressing aspect of planning, particular to this community. So all I'm saying, I guess, is that we should return some aspects of planning to local communities so they can actually make their local communities unique. Little Boxes comes to mind straight away.
Right.
That's all right in a suburb on out of Melbourne, but really the character of this town should be built by the characters of this town in a planning sense. And I think it's distressing that, particularly that example here, it's particularly distressing that we're faced with that.
Emma, Germano, agriculture too gets a bad rap, doesn't it, from the environmental sector? I mean, the costs of big commercial production agriculture are pretty well known and probably exaggerated a lot of the time.
I was going to say pretty well understood. Misunderstood is probably a better thing to say there, I think.
Right. Well, what can we do? Is agriculture doing what it can at the moment, or can it do better?
I think it can always do better. We can always do better, definitely. To think that agriculture is something that's separate from the environment is, I think that delineation is actually the crux of the problem, because farmers are in fact part of the environment. Their farms are the environment. They're stewards of the environment. And if you don't equip farmers, who I think are in control of more than 50% of the land mass in Australia, if they're not equipped to actually take care of that environment, you're missing the biggest opportunity there. You've got those stewards of the land who need to be encouraged to look after their land, but we as consumers, or we as a community or a society, don't value, we're not paying for that agricultural care, that environmental care in agriculture. So we get paid on volumes, we're in commodity markets and times are tough, and supply chains are complicated. If we were getting paid on the nutrient density in our food that we produce because we've looked after the soil and for the carbon neutrality on our farms and things like that, if we started to shift the way that farmers are actually remunerated, we would see that you've already got an army of people there that can take care of the environment, who are dedicated to that land, in many cases, multi-generationally caring about that land and very connected to it. Who better to be taking care of the environment than the farmers themselves? So it's a real shame when we pit one against the other, and often there is a political agenda that drives that pitting of one against the other, and it's a real shame because it's actually one and the same thing. And we need food to eat, that's the reality of it. So we've got to have these trade-offs between what a utopian view of what the environment should be able to do, and realising that we're actually just part of that environment, and we're, one species managing our existence within it.
So you don't think there's really terribly much merit in the very typical city view that farmers will care about the plot of land that's theirs for what it can do for them, but don't necessarily care about the environment around it?
There's good and bad farmers, like there's good and bad people who live in cities, I think. So, but if you start creating the framework where people are actually getting remunerated for their care of the environment, and obviously being very careful, because I don't like to go anywhere where we start distorting markets. I think that's a very risky place to be. But ultimately, farmers grow food for people to eat. So if you're purchasing food from a farm, then you are also responsible for what that environmental impact is of that food that you eat. So consumers should be well aware of where their food comes from, and they should be asking for ethical treatment of workers and the land and animals, animal welfare and all of those things, but you also have to be willing to pay for that as well. So you can't expect that you get to go to the supermarket, you demand that a farmer grows 50% less on his land, that might make him financially non-viable or make his business non-sustainable, but that you don't want to pay double the price. It just doesn't work that way. So I think that the issue is that often the farmer gets lumped with the responsibilities for a lot of different things, and consumers are demanding different things, and we as a society should, because that drives production and best practice and innovation and all of those things. But consumers have to be part of that, and I think that the bit that's the farming industry's fault, or the onus, is on the farming industry to actually start forging those relationships with the consumers in a more meaningful way. I think farmers have given away a lot of their power to different avenues of the supply chain, and we're no longer telling our own story and telling the community about how valuable it is for agriculture to be sustainable, and that's socially sustainable, environmentally sustainable, and of course financially sustainable, because you can't do it if you're doing it for charity.
How might they be able to do that? I'm trying to think of ways you could get that story across. Does that mean you have to get the media a bit more on side? Are they not on side? What do you think?
I think the media will tell whatever story is suiting them on any particular day. So one day we've got farmers hugging cows and how great we are and producing milk, and how that provides consumers with the 60% of their iodine requirements if you have a glass of milk per day. So one day we hear that story, and the next day we're hearing about bobby calves that are being knocked on the head and being wasted and being taken from their mothers and that type of story. So I think I think that it was a great comment to say, let's stop talking about ideology and let's start talking about ideas, because ultimately you start talking about extremes in ideology and it starts a debate that might not necessarily have practical outcomes that are meaningful and help us all take a step in a direction together.
I'm going to bring up the dirty word of water, and I'll ask this question of Ross, if for no other reason than his last name is Lake. So it seems that... but it seems to me that this water discussion, if you could call it that has been going on for the last decade, at least it's been hot for the last decade, and particularly the last couple of years. A lot of people, myself included, see it as just an endless campaign fought between belligerents with competing interests. So it's very hard to get to the bottom from a journalist perspective as to what the truth is. Is there anything we all agree on?
No.
Right.
I think that's with absolute certainty. And it was a lot hotter the decade before this one, than as in during the Millennium Drought, or drier might be a better word, than the last decades, because we have enjoyed a few good years, and that's lulled us into a false sense of what in fact the consequences were of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and more importantly the delinking of water right from the ownership of land itself and its utilisation in agriculture. In 2010 I had the displeasure of sitting in front of a Senate Standing Committee in relation to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, which was in its infancy, and we'd only had 2 years then, I think, of water trading. And I said 5 things to them then, which really, in my opinion, has come back to haunt the whole process when it comes to water. One thing, the things that I said, I guess, in a nutshell, were that if you turn water into a medium of exchange, it will in fact take on all the characteristics of money. And you know what they say about money. For those of you who don't, it's the root of all evil. Once we've made that step into that, what I consider an abyss, we've made the second mistake. We've said that as a medium of exchange, it's no longer a common good. So we've in fact devalued its importance as a resource. We've effectively, and I've used this phrase more recently, we've effectively turned it into a cryptocurrency. And it's distressing. The other distress is, of course, that the neoliberal economic argument for doing that was, there are many arguments, but one of them was, of course, that the market would allocate the resource equitably to its most efficient use. Sorry, bullshit. I operate in markets all day, every day, at about, a large amount of, in a large way. It's the oil industry, and I've never been this close to anyone from the ACCC before. So I'm edging away. If you think the dynamics of market ensure that things are efficiently allocated, then quite frankly, you're a fool. And if you sat in a room developing that policy and you thought that water would go to the most efficient use in terms of agriculture, you're also a fool. It'll go to the deepest pockets and the biggest risk takers. It's as simple as that. The other thing I said to that Senate Standing Committee, and this has really come home to haunt one particular commodity group, because I think it's really important that we can buy $4 cotton T-shirts in Woolworths. And I said, you can only manage this if you measure it. And that we had the technology at that point in time to commence measurement, and one state in particular deliberately sought not to measure its offtakes, and that has led to where we are today. I said a few other things, but if you want to go and read the submission to the Senate Standing Committee, and then compare with what the South Australian Royal Commission said, you'll find that really 10 years later we haven't come a lot further on. So that's where I stand in terms of the water debate. I know for a fact that we're already at 12% of the available water in this region in the hands of people simply trading, not doing anything else with the water. I'm unable to access the data that'll tell me what percentage of the remainder sits and is being used effectively and efficiently. I can pretty well see that those who got through the millennium drought by using rented or temporary water won't get through this drought, if in fact it goes for more than a couple of more years. As many people in this room will know, the price of temporary water is $550 a meg in this reach at the moment for high security water, and it's $5,500 to $6,000 for permanent water, right? I would suggest that I know 550 is already an unsustainable level for a dairy farmer. It went to $1,200, I think, a megalitre at the height of the millennium drought. They're unsustainable numbers for people's pockets who have already been picked by the circumstance of their farming circumstance, and they may not have been knocked out by the first punch a decade ago, but they won't sustain a second.
What do you think, Mick? I know you believe the water market as it is can work, or do you think it does?
No, I think I'd best put it as can. And firstly, I think we need to put it into context. So we tend to forget that, unlike perhaps the land of some of our European ancestors, we have an enormously variable climate, the most variable climate of any nation, I would argue. We tend to forget that, for example, when Sturt and his party first got to Bourke and found the Darling River in 1828, it was too salty to drink because, of course, it was in a drought period, and the only reason they could get there was the Macquarie marshes were so dry that they could find a way through it. So we tend to forget that context. We tend to forget the difficulty of the politics of water. I mean, we agreed federation in 1901. Guess what year the first River Murray agreement was finally settled between the three states? 1915. It took 15 years to even get that basic agreement that New South Wales and Vic shared this much water and gave South Australia that much.
Why did it take so long?
Water is life. Whoever gets it can do enormous things with it, but and look at the wars that have been fought in Europe and other places over access to water and access to the resources that are associated with it. So that's no excuse. So then we get to the issue of the water market, and certainly there is no doubt that a water market without verifiable and administered rules is the worst of the robber baron markets of the 19th century in the US, for example. There's no doubt about that. So, and I think there's no question that New South Wales and equally Queensland didn't take the necessary action to first get in place sensible measurement and then enforce the rules associated with that sensible measurement. So I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I think in terms of the tradability of water, I mean, I think the issue isn't that the price of temporary water at $5.50 or whatever is too high for a dairy farmer. I think the problem is that the returns for dairy farming and the dollar values that are coming through there are such that it's no longer affordable. Mm-hmm. But don't forget that when dairy farmers have got to that point and said, right, I'm going to put that water on the market, and they've realised an economic return from that and been able to do something else with that. So we all hate change, me as much as anyone else, but the reality is that I think the water market, at least in concept and to a certain extent in the way it operates, is in effect doing what it should do.
I mean, do we want milk or cotton? Or, because that's the exchange. That's the exchange. That's the exchange which is occurring.
We don't decide that.
That's right.
Well, we should be. We should be cap and collaring the market.
Well,
we should
then we get to the situation
that's
where
a slippery slope.
You tell Emma
because
you have to grow potatoes this year. I don't care what the price is.
That's right. And the thing is that when you're given an allocation, you make a plan as a farmer in order for that sustainability that I'm talking about. So once we start dictating what crops can be grown where, then the first thing that someone could say is, well, hang on, anybody who's up on the Murray who's got a dairy farm, well, you all have to move to Gippsland. So don't boo-hoo about the water price, because it's actually not the most efficient use of water when we can have more dollars off table grapes, or we can have more dollars off almonds being exported. So it's just not that simple, and different crops are used in rotations to make other crops more sustainable. So it's not, you can't just blanket ban, you can't grow that crop. And I think that if we get to that, I mean, if it's not illegal, then it's a farmer's decision as to what it is that he or she should be growing in order to make their farming business resilient. So I don't think you can just say don't grow cotton, because if the same farmer uses the exact same amount of money for a different crop, is that more valuable?
I wasn't suggesting that you don't grow cotton. I'm suggesting that the market will allocate the water to that crop, because a cotton farmer can make 18% return on his capital. And as I said right at the beginning, the inexorable march of capital and its desire for return will override any social concern, will override the individual choices of farmers over the long term. I'll give you a historical example. I always liken it to the fall of Russia, and all of the factory workers were given shares in their factories. That's effectively what we did when we decided to leave all those shares with all of those 6,000 farmers across the basin or whatever. Ultimately, where did all those shares end up in those manufacturing and factories in Russia? They all ended up in the hands of the oligarchs. That's a simple answer. You're going to end up with water oligarchs. It might take, it's not going to happen in the decade that it happened in that historical example, but it's going to happen over 30, 40, 50 years here, unless we cap and collar ownership, unless we cap and collar markets when the resource is in scarcity.
So then how do you allocate it?
Well, I think, if I could just say something.
Go for it.
Well, I'm happy to chat about that, but
the whole separation, whether it's carbon credits and all of those sorts of things, takes the assumption that everything can only be well managed under private ownership, including water. That's what it assumes. So the governments are there in that sense, just determining, who gets to own this in that sort of sense, because you're buying it In a way, it's on loan because the government's running around doing some things. But within that, if you're looking at planning for the future, like really planning to say this is what our conditions are, then water has to be seen as a communal resource at all times. And in which case, there needs to be a different set of decision making, which of course comes into conflict in global markets because of where the products are. I mean, we see it all the time. I was just having a bit of a laugh. People who do the renos on my house were arguing that we shouldn't eat quinoa because it raises the price in Bolivia. So the Bolivians who actually need this high nutrient food can't get it because we all want to be cool, healthy.
That's called culinary appropriation. Isn't it?
Absolutely. But what you see is these things are happening globally. And in which case, when we're talking about ideologies and regulation, we do regulate and we do have ideologies. The fact is, in a neoliberal or actually a corporatist planning system where people with money and interest get the most say, means that those ideologies are only things that people on the collective side have, because it's assumed that the ones who are making the decisions are neutral in their decision making.
But hang on,
so we have to uncover some of these things and actually have these debates publicly about these things. What's the collective? What's the public good? What's the public interest?
But hang on. Just don't forget, who is the biggest single owner of water entitlements in the system?
The environment.
Correct.
The government.
But
the government.
But why should we,
so the decisions about...
Why should we be surprised about that? Because once upon a time, the environment owned 100% of it.
But no one's suggesting that it's one versus the other. But the reality is, you can say stop all irrigation, and then what? So once again, we're now talking about ideology rather than ideas.
Yeah,
I went to a kibbutz in Israel, and I just could not get my mind around the fact that, you know, you've got this group of people and they all live together, and the doctors put in the same amount and the cleaners put in the same amount, and everybody's happy, and I just could not get past it. And I said to the guy who was the allocated leader for that period of time, because it, you know, and the guy who's the leader is doing the dishes just like everybody else, contributing to this society. And I said, but does it really work? He said, our kibbutz is very, very rich, and the rich can afford their ideology. So what we're talking about is being rich people who have never ever experienced hunger in this country. We've got legacy of that through our migrants, you know, our migrant history of people who have got that memory, but we don't have that memory. So all of a sudden we go, righto, the water belongs 100% to the environment, 100% to the government. Where is the food going to come from, and how important is food security?
But it's not an us them, and I don't think I was suggesting that. What I was suggesting is that we need to have conversations about how we do manage this, and whether it starts at a more community level, that starts here, saying, okay, look, we need to have these, how does it work throughout the system? Because right now we've entrusted certain politicians, you have the scientists who argue for the environment, so you have a very adversarial approach to how we manage this, because it is scarce, but we're not taking a collective approaching it from a commons value. It's very much of, I need to have this, I need to buy it, and it is a commodity in that sense. And by doing it, it's not an either or, and this is where I think we're drawing out, is not necessarily the water itself, but the conversations that we're having, because they are polarized, and they are in the media, if you want to bring it up in the media. They are the way that our politicians discuss it. Where I see ideology is the problem, is when it's taken to this extreme that it blinds us. Ideology is important because that's what sets our vision of what we think is a good place, what is a good future. Because we need to believe in something. And some people believe in more collective approaches. Some people believe in more free market approaches. It's when we believe that it has to happen to the exclusion of any other approach that the problem is. So in terms of bridging these conversations, we need to really put it on the line here, because it hasn't been effective up until now, and we do face some incredibly serious problems.
But I think
hold on, I'm going to have to stop this here and make myself sick by reminding myself of Tony Jones by interrupting everyone. But in 20 minutes' time, there's going to be questions, and I've got a sneaky suspicion that water's going to dominate that little half-hour period. So let's just move along. We'll swing back here. But something you said, Emma, reminded me of something I read the other week, which is that the number of vegans has quadrupled in the last 5 years, or at least people who identify as vegans.
She only says that because she's a vegetable grower.
Yeah, but
No, we have
People-
livestock too.
people-
It just
people
depends
who-
on the audience whether or not I admit to that.
yeah. Well, of course, the word identified is the key one there. You know, they're probably virtue signalling and down at McDonald's at 2 o'clock when no one's looking. But at least they identify as vegans. The point is, if that keeps going at the rate it's going, is the agriculture industry prepared for that? People not eating meat in 50 or 100 years' time? And is it a good thing?
We've used the word ideology, and I think that this is a pure example of ideological debate, because everybody has the right to choose what they eat. So whether you're a vegan or you're a omnivore or a flexitarian or whatever buzzy trend word that you want to talk about on the day is kind of irrelevant, because you might have people who are vegans but they choose not to eat avocados. So it's just one thing that makes up an entire plate of food or an entire cuisine. There are other places in the world that will continually want to eat meat, and again, the rich can afford their ideology. So I get really, really worried when the animal activist agenda is about no one can eat meat. So there's a difference between saying I believe in something and these are the things that I would like to share as to why I believe it, and maybe you might believe it too if I tell you that. If we had storms of people rocking up to any other businesses, flooding, whether they were churches or mosques or whatever else, the contempt that's being shown to the agricultural community right now, dollar fines for people breaking in and trespassing and stealing things in the name of ideology. If it was in the name of religious ideology, as a nation, we would all say that is absolutely outrageous and we won't tolerate it. For some reason, that argument is gaining traction, and I actually think it's more to do again with unfortunately, sometimes some of my farming counterparts are a little bit backwards in their mentality. So they go, lock them out and what can we do, and give them big fines and whatever else. And my answer would be, hang on a minute, when we know this weekend, apparently on the 8th, we've got something planned, the animal activists are talking about how there's going to be an event. And I would say, well, my response would be every animal farmer of any description, with whatever animal product you're farming, have an open day on your farm on that same day. Because the public shouldn't be understanding or fearing that there's something that an animal activist is going to uncover that they don't understand already about the way that about the food that they eat. You have a right to understand. You have a right to expect certain standards. And we as an industry are sometimes, I think, a little bit scared because some of the things that we do aren't quite great. And then sometimes there's just some realities. Like the reality is, if you drink milk, most farms take those calves that have been born, just so you all know, off a female cow, within 24 hours of birth. That is the reality of how we get milk. We do have male chicks in the broiler systems and in egg systems. Male chicks do die at a day old once they've been sexed. This is the reality of agriculture. Once I tell you the reality of it, you can choose whether or not you feel comfortable with it or not. And then as good business people and not just food producers, we're going to start catering to a market. So we don't need the people in Bolivia to miss out on quinoa. If we realise people want to eat quinoa in Australia, let's grow some quinoa in Australia. And the person who adapts to the change in market is going to be rewarded for that adaptation, I guess. But is it a threat? It's a threat more to undermining the trust in the food system. But all of a sudden we're worried that the Amazon's going to get wiped out because Brazil looks like it's going to be getting all of the market share of soybeans into China. We wipe out the Amazon. There's environmental implications. It's not just as simple as plants versus animals. If, I go and plough a field, there's going to be worms that die. The value of the life of a worm is not greater to me than the value of a life of a cow. I assure you, worms wiggle away if you try and cut off, when you're a kid and you're in the garden and you're doing that. Everything has a will to live, and it comes down to the ideology. Do you believe that it's okay to use plants and animals for human needs? And if you feel like the answer is no, you're going to go hungry pretty quickly. And that's just the reality. We exist in this environment, and it is our job to do that in a sustainable manner as appropriately. But other than that, what we need to do is say, okay, the world's overpopulated by 50%. Just so you know, you guys are the ones that are going. Everybody on the left-hand side of the room, you can't live anymore because we don't want to interrupt the environment. So it's all well and good to have that ideological debate when you've got the money to be able to afford to eat quinoa, but when you're living in the slums in India, you will eat whatever you are given to eat. So again, it's one of those things that people who have got the money to afford to be able to have those debates have them.
Mick, studies in Europe post-Soviet tell us a bit about what keeps communities alive, don't they? We've had a conversation about that last week.
Yeah, no, there's some very interesting stuff because, of course, once the Berlin Wall came down and the unification of East and West occurred, there were some real challenges because, of course, even a single nation like Germany had hugely disparate economic conditions and social conditions on either side of that wall. And there's some obvious things like natural amenity. If you've got a wonderful flowing river or snowfields or whatever, that obviously ticks the box. But it's interesting, and this isn't a sponsored comment, it's interesting, the one factor that they did find was quite significant in successful development strategies for regions was strong tertiary education institutions. So that if they had a good, strong tertiary education institution in a region or a city, the mechanism seemed to be that meant that the children who had capacity would go on to further training and stay there. The lecturers, and their families would live there, and so that would bring a professional level of expertise into the area, and of course services would develop off the back of that and also be associated with it. So it's a very interesting observation that particularly in a situation where economies are services dominated, we tend to forget that. We talk about agriculture, we talk about manufacturing, but in fact 70% plus people work in services, and more so as the population ages, etc. And so that I think is a very interesting observation, and obviously very pertinent to La Trobe's presence here and in places like Wodonga. I think there's a germ of whether it was deliberate or whether in fact it's coincidental, but I think there's some interesting lessons in that to think about in terms of how places like Mildura go ahead into the future.
Well, yeah, and we're talking, we should point out, about La Trobe specifically and not Monash. But do you,
it was Ross, A, not the.
There's a simple, there's a conflict of ideas there too, because I'm going to have another crack at planners. One of the fundamental problems for all big regional inland cities is the gap between the need and the provision, and so planners are constantly coming late to the story. So I'm a great believer in that if you build it, they will come. So if you want to create hubs in inland communities, and I probably should explain, I trade in Wagga, Albury-Wodonga, Shepparton, Swan Hill, right across through the Riverland, right down into South Australia, all the way up to Broken Hill. So I get to fight with lots of municipal councils. But the key for every one of those communities is, first of all, they need to learn to collaborate as a community. So because nothing brings a community unstuck than internal division quicker. So they need to manage their presentation to policymakers and influencers cohesively. And I'm not sure every community's done that well. Mm-hmm. Some have, some haven't done it particularly well. So I always refer back to the Victorian planners and how well they built infrastructure up to 100 years ahead of its need. Classic example everyone uses, of course, is the Melbourne sewage system. 400,000 people when it was built, 4 million now, and pretty sustainable.
But they just copied that off the Romans.
Quite possibly. We lost the cement recipe for a long time.
Yeah.
What we need to do as communities in inland Australia, and this is ideas, not ideology, is convince the distribution of our combined resources, if you like, what we heard on, what was it, Tuesday night, the federal budget, that infrastructure should be built out here. If you want to solve congestion in the cities, if you want to give people alternatives and cheaper places to live, I mean, who can live in Sydney or Melbourne now, really? You know, who can enjoy what we've got there? They're awful. So you have to actually create almost a romantic vision and a sustainable vision out in the regions. But you have to go and you have to build that infrastructure first, and then people will come. Don't give us token infrastructure. You know, I'm not suggesting that the building we're sitting in is token infrastructure, no. But you know, don't give us token infrastructure. Think about what you put out there, because if you look at population churn in the regions, there's about 8 million of us still out here. You know, this isn't old Australia, because we're often characterised generically as this is white settler old Australia, and we did all these horrible things. We're continuing to do all these horrible things to the Indigenous populations, and then now we're doing all these horrible things to the environment. So we're often characterised poorly. So we haven't actually sold the quality of life out here properly, and we haven't been supported by the policymakers and those who hold the bag of money. We haven't been supported by them appropriately, and I'm sorry if anyone's a member of the National Party, but they've been an abject failure for us as representatives. So,
can I add to that?
Yeah, sure. I was about to ask you about tourism, but
no. Well, I was going to say that I agree with many of those points, and I think one of them is transport. I mean, Mildura is an amazing place in terms of its amazing airport facility, its passenger travel, but also its connections through roads and the river and all that. But I think there's some essential things, and what's been politicised are things like public transport, alternative transport, aging. Not everyone drives. There's people with different abilities who can and can't drive. You know, driverless cars is not going to be a solution. So once again, we're looking at more of collective means. How do we actually get around? The state used to be like a complete patchwork of railways that was efficient, and you can get between towns. We still operate. You need to go into Melbourne to go out to somewhere else. And yet we're not having, you can't get from Bendigo to Albury easily, or any of these sorts of things. So I think we do definitely need the transport systems. We do need to start building community infrastructures so that there was an announcement made by Scott Morrison, let's throw everyone to the regions. And it was really a dumping, seeing the regions as a dumping ground, where we're not. There's huge opportunities. If you look at NIL and how they've worked with refugee populations and how that's changed their economy around, there's plenty of opportunity, but you need to have that resource. So you need language services, you need other sorts of building cohesion and integration in a way that both the receiving community can adapt, as well as the new communities coming here. But all of that takes money, and that all takes a proper national policy that doesn't focus on the major cities, or doesn't say major cities plus Bendigo and Newcastle or something like that. What they're not doing is seeing all of Australia and its settlements as part of an incredibly dense and vast network, because they don't plan for the spaces in between, which is often the agricultural land or our parklands and whatnot. And their inability to see that as a vision means that things aren't funded properly. And within that, matched with this thing of let's pay less taxes, let's not have taxes. Well, that's a real issue, because some of our infrastructures require it. We don't have the population like the United States. We're not as dense as Europe. You have fewer people who have to pay for this infrastructure. And yet there's this whole sort of narrative that taxes are bad. And if anyone's been to the United States, from my personal view, I'm Canadian, by the way, I'll own up. But the United States compared to Canada and their social structures are so different, because Canada has more of a social democratic approach to things. Australia, as I've seen over the last 25 years, is looking at an American model, and that's turning us backwards. So for the term third world nation, I would say the United States is that, because of their polarization, because of the violence. So within that, once again, it comes to the collective. How do we match a market approach with still having a social commitment, the social contract, to bring that together to solve some problems? And how do we start finding new ways to speak to each other. So even if we vociferously disagree about how we get there, we still have some common goal or some common vision of what prosperity looks like. And I think that that's one of the things we really have to focus on.
Guns and Roses.
And, you know, if it's going to
They
start...
haven't been valid for at least 20 years. But anyway, go on.
I was going to say, where is it going to start? Community conversations. You look at Kathy McGowan in Indi. How did she get elected? And from what I've been hearing about what's happening in Mildura, Mildura has an incredible base for these conversations. Mm-hmm. And they've already been happening.
Do you think, I mean, you know, I'm sure Mick does too, a lot of really interesting things are happening in Europe with infrastructure and planning and in regional areas. And is Australia not getting on the bus because we don't have the population, or is there something else there? Are we too daggy?
Absolutely political will. Mm-hmm. You know, the way that they're looking at funding tertiary education, that was brought up. Tertiary education, having a university in a town contributes to the social life, the cultural life, the economy. It lifts aspirations. It connects us internationally. You know, regional areas, rural areas are no longer backwaters. We're just as globally connected as major cities. And so they're incredibly important. But the federal government, we're one of the lowest, if not the lowest, in the OECD countries for subsidizing tertiary education, right? The lowest or the second lowest. That's a major issue. We have Parliament that keeps saying that education is a personal benefit rather than a collective community good. And so when health is privatized, when education is not seen as a collective good, and public transport and internet communications are seen as something that you can play political football with, we have a real issue, because those used to be non-partisan issues, because those were the things that we said, as long as we have this, we have a functioning society that we can build from. And so, yeah.
No, I just revealed my hand, didn't I? I'm supposed to be... No, that was very interesting.
I got a clap out of Emma, so, you know.
Just want to quickly touch on tourism. It's touted as the great saviour of regional areas, and to my way of thinking, it sort of runs the risk of turning good, authentic towns into theme parks.
Generic newt musters.
Yeah. The tourist dollar, is it everything it's cracked up to be?
Look, I think like all things, there can be bad aspects and good aspects. I'll give you an example of a good aspect. I was recently in Bourke, and those of you that would have travelled there at some stage or other would know that for quite a long while, it wasn't sensible to park your car in the street overnight in Bourke, and you certainly didn't walk around the street at night. Now that town has been transformed. And I was staying at a place called Kidman's Camp, which is about 5 k's north on the river. And I was talking to the fellow that owns it, and I said, "What's happened?" And he said, "Well, it's the Grey Nomad Trail." He said, "So the Grey Nomads all start from Adelaide and Melbourne in about April, and they come up to Mildura, and then they come up to Broken Hill, then they go across to Wilcannia, up to Bourke, and from there up through Queensland on their annual migration." And I actually saw it happen. I was standing in an area of 2 football fields that had no one in there until about 4 o'clock. And some of the biggest RVs and caravans and everything turned up. And there was probably literally 100 groups of people there by 6 o'clock. And it's just transformed the town. So, you know, you'd look at that example and say, okay, there's still social problems in Bourke, but the change in social amenity of Bourke now compared to what it was even 10 years ago is just enormous, and it's been driven off the back of the ageing population that wants to travel.
I can't see how the grey nomads... I mean, in Broken Hill, they come through all the time. They make their own sandwiches, and they steal toilet rolls out of our public toilets. Maybe they're taking them to Bourke.
Maybe you should...
That's why Bourke's doing so well.
Ban them. No, but... So I think, you know, there's a lesson in that tourism, to an extent, can be good.
Can be good.
You know, you only need to go to a place like Bali or some of those sorts of places to realise that tourism can also be a pretty terrible influence on a community. But
yeah, sure.
I don't think we're quite at that stage yet here.
I think it's time for questions, isn't it now? Does anyone have questions?
This will get it going. My name's Louise. As a farmer and an irrigator and a water owner, obviously this is a concerning issue for us. I'll take the point that I am very worried about the number of developments that go in lately that are all on temporary water, but someone's doing those approvals. I think that's a problem. But the other thing that concerns me, we lived in Leeton in 2007 at the height of the drought when rice was the cotton of the day, and almonds will be the new cotton too. And there was a lot of hysteria about rice growing. But the reality is that of that water, they take 3 crops from that water. So when we have the department of, who gets to grow what, who's going to make those decisions? And who knows? Who has the knowledge to know what should be grown and what should not? And when we've got rid of the farmers and it rains and there's water, what then? So it's not a simple argument by any means. Now we have a 180-acre farm that we manage at Calignan that grows cherries. Now, who else grows cherries here? Everyone will tell you that it can't be done. We're doing it quite nicely. So I'll just put that out there for you.
Sure.
I would say, can I just say, I don't think it's about saying what crops you can grow, but I think it is about thinking really long-term strategically in terms of what are our endpoints here and whether we accept either the Club of Rome old report that there are limits to growth and what we can do with our environment, and that there is a carrying capacity that we need to learn to work with, and in which case we then work backwards for saying, okay, if we accept this, then how do we do that? Or we take the Julian Simons approach, which is we're so ingenious that we'll always find a technological and managerial solution. And I think that that's really what it comes down to. And that's where I think the ideologies come through and where it's been battling. And it's probably a bit of both. I don't like balance because I think all the time, because I think sometimes we actually destroy our environment or destroy communities when we take on a false balance. But I think that we need to actually grapple with those two ways that we view or situate our solutions and think, okay, in 100 years, not 50, let's go with the French, in 100 years and working backwards, where will we be? What are the different options that could happen and how do we work there? What do we think is the one that we're working for? And I think we really have to learn to extend our imaginations so that we then start to bring our solutions down as to where we are now and start to be able to plan and also put money, real research money, into the different types of solutions. We have to start doing some trial and error right now because the way that research funding is, it's all based on people have all basically already done the research and it's a proven commodity and everyone knows what the research outcome is. We don't need that anymore. We need to go back and have some confidence in being experimental and not knowing the answers. So I think that what you're saying is valid, but I don't think choosing the crop is the right way. It could be that we can have all those crops. But like today, I had a bottle of water made from vegetables. I mean, like, so if we have those sorts of things, that's what we really need to capitalize. Put all the ideas on the table.
Yep.
My question is one about balance. Do we really need to find a balance in the whole situation? I think I've had 3 cups of coffee this morning, so I like my milk. I've had a couple of glasses of water. And like everybody else in the room, I'm wearing Chinese cotton. So we need it all, but we have to find the balance. So how do we find that balance? Because I don't think either, the dairy farmers aren't bad, the cotton farmers, we need them too. Either that or we should be here naked or something. So we need a bit of everything. How do we do that?
Ross?
I'm happy to have a crack at that. We need to develop a system which is dynamic and responsive to the circumstance at time. Because what we've been given with the plan is essentially a fixed idea. I don't think there's any point in reviewing the plan every 5 or every 10 years. I mean, we know that there's seasonal variation. We know that we can do opportunistic cropping around Leeton with rice growers. They use a lot of fuel. I really love it when we get a wet year, right? So, but we also know that the permanent cropping, if we increase the level of permanent cropping to a point at which deliverability fails, in other words, and the estimates are 2025, 2027 about what we know is going in the ground as permanent crops, then we're going to lose that capacity to have a dynamic response to the availability of the resource. So that's why I make the argument for some sensible control over the market. We have no sensible control over the market. New South Wales and South Australia don't even have an accessible water register. Victoria does, thank God, because we actually decided at some point to measure things. And that it'll be so transparent soon, it'll be online. But if you want to know where the water is in New South Wales and who's got hold of it and where it's going and where it's coming from, or even in South Australia, we can't do that at this point. So when we're getting inter-reach transfers now, it's 9, 10, 14 days between the states. It's 24 hours in Victoria, and it's quite transparent. So we actually need to devise a management system that has interoperability. In other words, the states actually talk to each other. You know, we're in the same situation we were prior to federation, where we all have different rail gauges, and we still haven't fixed that problem, right? You know, it's really dumb, and it's the parochialism of the states. And I said right at the beginning, it's the failure of federalism that is one of the root causes of every issue. You know, whether it's education, planning, and now we're talking about water. That failure to have an interoperability and a dynamic system to respond is what's causing the problem, what's exacerbating the problems.
Yeah.
I might suggest something a bit troublesome there. It sounds to me like what you're saying is democracy is a problem. Because, you know, isn't it in fact the case that, as well-minded as people might be, people are going to vote for what is good for them and good for their children to the detriment of the rest of the world?
No, I'm not suggesting at all.
But see,
there's a little bit of democratic socialism in that particular speech. I'm more than aware of that. But we've lost control of the common resource in many respects, or it's veering out of control, and we need to think about how we get it back under control. Getting it back under control is a management and measurement problem. This is where I come from in terms of what I do every day. It's managing and measuring, and we're failing to do that with this resource, and it's got consequences, and it's got social and economic consequences. We haven't even talked about them.
Mm. We've been talking about it. Sorry, over here. God, how are we ever going to get anywhere when it takes this long to get a microphone across the room?
Jeez.
Thanks.
Thank you. My question to the panel it relates to a point that is mostly overlooked in these kind of mainstream discussions about regions and regional cities. And that is the place of the Aboriginal land estate in the future of cities, of regions and regional cities. And I say that because I ask the question because about a third of the national estate is actually repossessed by Aboriginal people. That's very uneven. So in places like Dareton, just over the river here, there's I think they only have 10 successful land claims. So that's a very uneven story. And in other parts, in the Barwon Darling, for instance, where you have significant Aboriginal populations are facing at the absolute forefront of this water crisis. They're without reliable drinking water. So yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts about the place of the Aboriginal land estate in the future of regions and regional cities.
I think it's going to become far more prominent in the future within planning. There is a whole movement called decolonising planning. It is now part of the education that we must demonstrate to the Planning Institute of Australia how we are ensuring that future planners understand issues of title, land rights, and the whole history. The whole settlement of planning, geographers, surveyors, is through mapping and control, and that's what we have done. And we took away something from a communes and under a communal management system and turned it into a private system. I think that it is one of our greatest challenges to work much better with Aboriginal communities, and I think that by doing that, it'll force, the dominant organisations and us as communities to have to be a lot more creative in terms of our stewardship. And I think that it will also reveal that there's not as much animosity as what's sometimes publicly believed between Aboriginal people and farmers and all those different groups, and we'll start to form different alliances. I don't know how to move us forward, but it will be definitely changing through planning into the future.
Talk on that.
No, it's a really vexed issue, and I'm not sure there's anyone has any instant answers. But in all my travels around, it just strikes me again and again where Aboriginal culture is either sustained or regenerated. There seems to be a way forward for the communities, and where it's not, there doesn't seem to be, and that seems a strange thing, because I guess we've had decades and decades of saying, well, there's a problem with Indigenous communities, we better put money there. And I'm not saying that re-establishing culture and re-recognising culture is a substitute for money, but it just seems to me that the communities, particularly as you go up through Central Australia and into Northern Australia, the communities that have managed to either maintain or re-establish elements of culture and connection with the land seem to be better in terms of managing those communities than the ones that don't. So I think there's a German idea there that, and I guess it's connection to land, that if we can, and I guess that it shouldn't surprise us in some respects. We all enjoy our own culture, our own identity, and our own association with communities, etc. So it shouldn't surprise us. But I just find that an interesting observation, and I'm not discounting all the other needs of Indigenous communities and the issues around land, but that's just an observation I make on the way around.
Well, sort of in the same ballpark, if we're talking about foreign ownership, which essentially is what we're talking about. That's the dirty phrase at the moment, isn't it? When you look at the map of Australia, it's getting around on the internet, the map of Australia with the amount of Australian land that's under Chinese interest now. Is it as dirty word as they're making out? We're talking money.
It's a very difficult issue, because I could say that 100 farmers wanting to buy land are opposed to overseas ownership, and one farmer selling land is very keen on overseas ownership. I think, again, in the historical context, overseas capital, in a sense, developed many of the resources here. They certainly didn't take it with them when the owners of that capital left. I think we're seeing it now. It's interesting to me the extent to which the noted purchases of large farms by overseas capital are in fact a substitution of one overseas owner for another. We tend to not recognise that. So, the classic one was the Van Diemen's Land company in Tasmania that runs 16 dairy farms, and there was the potential for Chinese ownership, and in fact is now in Chinese ownership and not doing all that well, so told, but tended to get forgotten that had been owned for many, many years by a regional council in New Zealand. It was already in overseas ownership. So, I think...
New Zealand should actually own a bit more of Australia, actually.
Yeah.
Because
I think there's a bit of a movement for that.
I do, and I think that New Zealand also offers us a really good model to start working for in terms of working with Aboriginal communities as us as a society, because every New Zealander knows a little bit of Maori, they know the haka.
Culture.
They aren't Maori, but Maori is part of their national culture. We don't have that in Australia.
What did they do differently? How did they get that?
The treaty.
Treaty. We rejected the statement that had been worked in years. We've rejected that. And that's about power and control and who gets to retain it. We're unwilling, as a general society, if we're non-Aboriginal, together we're making collective decisions that say we are not willing to share power. Things can only be done in a certain way. And I think that New Zealand's showing us that things can actually be done in a different way. And until we start losing that aggressiveness, that adversarial, proprietorial approach to all of our relations, because it's all very transactional.
Let's just talk briefly about Ebenezer Howard.
Yes.
He was a planner in the early 20th century who proposed this idea called the Garden City. Correct me if I get it wrong, but it's sort of a hub and spoke idea, isn't it, where you've got a central city surrounded by satellite towns connected by spokes.
Yep.
Rapid transport, rapid communication. And the reason why his critics sort of dumped him way back when he was proposing this was because communication and transport neither were sophisticated enough for his model. Well, it is now, both of them. Do we have that? Are we looking back at that now, the Garden City? It takes in the best and worst, leaves out the worst and takes in the best of both cities and regional
Look, in
areas.
some ways we have it. Albury-Wodonga is situated like that. Turgoona, if anyone looks at the maps. But it relies a lot on car transport. We need the public transport. But there's been a whole bunch of other models as well. Le Corbusier with the high-rise city and the parking underneath. That leads to drug dealing underneath in some areas, depending. There are different models of city building that can be made. And for an Australian psyche, we can have higher density and achieve some of that if we start looking to places like Finland or even the city of Montreal, where that high density is only 3 or 4 story, where people might own a story. We don't have to have high rises to achieve that. But within that, there is a social determinism within that, because it's about whether we also include, right now we'd like to separate our poor members of our communities into those areas. And so there's a sense of exclusion. I work with kids in a place called Eaglehawk in Bendigo. And the kids in the poor neighbourhood, when they look and they see their poor neighbourhood, they say, this is why Bendigo thinks we're losers. They know that. And until we start saying, okay, we need to have 25% of any new development going into low income or some sort of co-op housing, and until we're starting to want to live with neighbours who are not the same as ourselves, we're going to have a problem. Because you can see the social polarisation, Toorak versus Broadmeadows, let's say, in Melbourne. But it happens in regional areas as well, whether it ends up being that you move to a small town with no services. Older people who don't have money might be doing that. They're then shut off from medical care. They're shut off from visits, those sorts of things. Until, I do think we have to have a certain sort of density. We do have to bring that in together, but we also have to do it with a social and cultural mind as to how do we as a community bring everyone along with us and show different role models. And once again, it comes to education. How do we draw people in? We won't draw in everyone, but right now, leaving it up to free market on its own, we've seen a huge divide in Australian society, economically and socially. And that's happening in the regional areas here. I'm sure everyone here knows what areas of Mildura, you don't go to, or what pubs you don't go to, or those sorts of things.
How do you feel about the dreaded Westfields? Shopping centres. I don't mean specifically Westfield, but they...
I was just feeling really terrible because, so I have the farm in Gippsland and then I have a house and office in Richmond, and I do some business with the growers in Werribee, and I start to get the chills when I drive over the Westgate Bridge. So I'm one of those people guilty of the need for segregation, I guess, sometimes.
All right, yeah.
But I actually just feel bad, like, talking for too long. There's, like, some burning questions.
Are there?
They're waving at us saying...
I'm moving around the panel because I thought everyone was being coy. No, go right ahead.
No, we certainly aren't. We're Mildura people.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk about self-determination and about the government trusting more in regional communities. And I just pick up a point that Ross made, and it's a very good one, about planning. And he mentioned about agriculture and about the C89 and that. Well, and I'm a councillor, and we decided on a direction to go as far as planning in the Moya is concerned, in the old irrigated areas. And for years we've had consultants come up and go through these appraisals and submissions that we make to government, and learned people from VCAT. So we had our last one, that determination that we sent down to the government. The planning department in the government passed it, and it was about the variation, Ross, from the 10 to the 10 hectare. It got through the bureaucrats in the planning department, and the minister, on his own stroke of the pen, decided to make a decision. Yeah, decided to make a decision of his own undertaking. He probably's got a great degree in planning, I don't know, but
I didn't teach him.
But yeah, but the issue is that's what frustrates communities. We've got a lot of learned people in our community that, brought together, could make wonderful decisions from an infrastructure perspective, from a futuristic perspective, but we're not allowed to because somebody mentioned democracy before.
That's what I was about to say.
I
Here we come back to this.
I really wonder. But I'll leave that with Ross. He might like to add more to that because he understands the situation. We've been doing it for 130 years, by the way, up here. So we do know something about it.
You want me to have another crack at democracy? Well, there's really 3-star, 2-star and 1-star, and that's going back up the scale: 1-star at municipal level, 2-star at state level, and 3-star at federal level. And your capacity to influence in any of those forums is the opposite, really. What can you really do with a Local Government Act, quite frankly? I mean, the Local Government Act's essentially robbed the community of its democracy. It's 1-star democracy. The state government, you know, the state governments and where they choose to exercise control and choose to collaboratively work with other state governments, and water policy is a classic issue of that. You know, there's your 2-star democracy, and the 3-star democracy is what we do federally. You know, I'm a great believer that we've got 2 self-perpetuating cults at the moment, all of whom sit pretty well in the middle of the political spectrum, all of whom in their self-perpetuation, they're dropping in of candidates, their preferred candidates, and those preferred candidates aren't really made by the locals anymore. That destruction it has, over the last 3 decades, impacted really severely on our independence. And I actually find that quite distressing, and that's why, you know, I said very early, you know, I'm part of the sort of worn out, frustrated 60% in the middle, you know, not at the 10% at one end of the far right or the 10% at the other end at the far left. You know, we need to find a way to get back to self-determination in a lot of areas. And how are we going to do that? Well, at the moment, this community's decided that we might just throw a few independents into the mix and see what happens, because we've got nothing to lose. You know, I don't think the vote for the shooters, fishers and farmers in the New South Wales election had anything to do with everyone wanting to shoot everything that moves and chop down everything that doesn't. You know, I think that was the only point that they could play a protest vote about their dissatisfaction. And they'll all swing back to somewhere when they feel that they're being represented appropriately.
If that was the only option, that was an extraordinary option to go to. Well, if their reasons for voting were so weak.
If you're going to slap someone in the face, hit them hard. What hurts the most? Ideologically, I think that we just chose that electorate just chose to hurt the system. You know, I think that I don't think that I'm trying to think. They got 40,000 votes, and they got 14,000 something votes. You went and asked those 14,000 people what the 10 principles of the shooters, fishers, and farmers policy platforms were. I reckon everyone would strike out. I don't think they'd know. They just went with a gut. I'm sick of these bastards. Let's just whack them as hard as we can in the most inappropriate way that we can.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's quite destructive, and it's a shame. I would probably, if we got rid of democracy and I could be the benevolent dictator of the country, I would get rid of one level of government. And I think that it's unfortunate because the state governments are starved of funds to be able to do things in a meaningful way. Local councils are starved of funds to do things in a meaningful way. I think you're either affected by things collectively at a federal level or you're affected by things directly in your community. So, sorry, Ali, but I'd be getting rid of the state level of government if I had that opportunity. Because I was thinking, we had bushfires in our area a couple of weeks ago, and I was thinking about all the reviews and the CFA and all that drama that happened and everything that happened after, the 10 years after Black Saturday, and where all of the focus had gone was on the politics of everything. It was, review after review and making sure that the government could cover their arse, and yes, they got a text message out on time, so if people die next time, you got a text message out on time and things like that. And I thought, if all that effort had gone into equipping the local communities to deal with fighting fires, if all of that effort had gone into helping the people who help each other, because that's what happens every single time a community's down and out. It'll be the direct community around it, or someone in a group in the community is down and out. It is the community around it that support those people that are down and out. And I think that it's so vital that we ensure that our local communities, whether they're regional or even if that is a suburb in a city, that they're resilient and adaptable to change and able to take care of themselves and self-determining. I think that is where, we said, is it politics that drive it, or is it the people that drive it? The reality of what happens day to day is that people drive that. And then we seem to have to adapt to whatever policy or whatever government comes in at any period of time. But it's about equipping the communities to take care of themselves. And that's key. And often unfortunately, we've seen very irresponsible local councils doing all sorts of irresponsible things, and there's a lot of faith or trust that's been lacking there. But on the same token, these councillors are trying to get their money from somewhere to run meaningful communities and don't have enough money.
Can I ask you a question just quickly on that? Are you finding, because I've been watching what's happening with the leadership within farming communities and organisations, but also the independents, a lot of them are women. And do you think that right now in the dissatisfaction that they're coming up with a different set of ideas?
Did you say women?
Women, yeah. Do you think that has... I've just been reading some of the politics in terms of the independents
there's not that many of them. Number one, there's not that many of them. I think that there's a frustration because I have to be really mindful and try to be politically correct, but I've come into an organisation that I actually think needs to change and get with the times and start changing the conversation. And then we saw the Weekly Times put out an article a couple of months ago that showed how actually farmers in the country have these really politically progressive ideas, and actually that's not the sentiments that are coming out of, like you said, the National Party or the farming organisations. But it is so difficult to change the status quo because, of course, when you're in there and you start trying to change the status quo, everybody who's got power currently, they have to lose their power in order for things to change. And there's a lot of blocking of that. So I think that people are actually... there are some women, yes, I think, that are stepping up and saying we want to see change, and you've got to do it by belting your head against a brick wall for a period of time. But there's more people who are stepping outside the system and trying to create influence in other ways. So we as a farming organisation can put out a tweet and people might pick it up or they might not, and then you see some young woman in South Australia saying goodbye to her dairy herd and all of a sudden that goes viral. So there's more ways than these structures that exist to create influence in our society now, and I think that all membership organisations are struggling with trying to work out how do we communicate our message and is it even valid anymore, and do people want to be part of these communities? We absolutely have to change the way that we're doing things for it to be meaningful, because I still believe that the voice is really important.
Over here somewhere.
I need to throw it.
Maria, that's my name. Just a couple of things. Mildura has, to Melbourne, there's an Auslink line, rail line, and we're the only inland city without a passenger train, creating a connectivity with our capital city and social and economic and environmental bonuses in terms of your topic, which is dried out the future of inland cities. That would be one solution. To return our train, and considering there's an election coming up, we hear nothing from the local, some of the people running the major parties about the return of the passenger train. The other thing is too that Bridget McKenzie, the National Party person, said there's no money in the budget for the Murray-Darling Basin, and all we need is rain, more water in the system. That's the reality. So if we've got politicians that actually don't grasp the whole situation, what do we do about it? Julie and Ross, I wouldn't mind you answering 1 and 2. Yeah, thank you.
I would say agitate for sure. And I think it is happening through the way that people are voting. We saw that in New South Wales. We saw that in Victoria. I think formal letters, forget about the email, I think actually still posting still has greater effect. Use your universities, get studies done. We treat transport planning, so we'll treat that as a topic next semester. I'll speak to the transport planning. And this is where the universities and educators, there's a lot of resources in terms of student projects who can help you get some base data and put your arguments together in all different areas. And I think that that's one way to do things. Mildura definitely needs a rail service all the way through to here. It has the hub. Train freight is still the best, more efficient way, as I understand, for certain overhaul of product. And there's a lot of studies. So sometimes I think it's about the community reaching out to get this information. Some of it blocked behind paywall because it's, even though we're public servants as educators, often our articles go behind paywall so the journals can make money. So I think it's reaching out in that way, finding out the different organizations can help, and seeing what they can do and what arguments they've made. Look for case studies in other towns. Invite people who have done something in another town. Give them the accommodation and a dinner for the night and have a chat. But I think that's where the social media is, online, finding out how people are coordinating themselves and organizing. I think, yeah.
Well, I'm happy to have a chip at this, although it's, I'm not sure how you put trains and water together, Maria, but you managed.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with the return of the train as long as it's a diesel. So, I wasn't being entirely flippant, but to paraphrase what Julie was saying, solutions to problems need evidence. So if you can get an evidence-based research, and I know that a lot of work's been done. Let's talk about the train first. If you can get a lot of evidence-based research that justifies the subsidisation, because it would be a subsidised service. I don't think we can argue that it wouldn't be. Lots of services are subsidised by government, so then we could look at the return of the train. And the other thing about finding solutions is seeking a value-neutral assessment. And let's leave the values and the prioritisation of those things to those who we've elected to make the final decision. So, and that's a tough thing to ask, but that's how we have to work as a community. Otherwise, we'd be voting on everything. There'd be a vote on something every single day. So, and this is the other issue that we've got that I wanted to raise in the context of this, and that is country people have always kowtowed to legitimate authority in a very easy way. One of the problems we've got now, whether it's the issue is the return of a train or the issues we have around water, is there's a bit of a breakdown in our belief that the authority is legitimate. And that's what all of us are struggling with. And we struggle with that across every issue that's come up in this forum today. So what's undermined that legitimacy? Well, you can point to any number of scandals, any number of corruptions, any number of parochialism to particular areas or priorities. So how do we fix that? What's the idea that can fix that? Well, the person who comes up with that, I'll be voting for.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes you have to just be incredibly political, because I think something, and I would never defend our politicians, because I think the culture of politics in Australia has just gotten to a point where it's a joke, and it's that, where does the whole thing start? You know, media, politics, is it the society that we are, that we go out and buy those media articles, or we retweet that thing that we shouldn't probably retweet, and things are sensationalised. There are a lot of competing interests in a lot of cases, so sometimes being in the role of in representative roles, you are making trade-offs, and it is actually really, it is quite difficult. So I think understanding some of that complexity, but it's about having enough people that support it. It's just as simple as that. You just have to make enough noise, and there has to be a logical, reasonable argument, and even then sometimes it doesn't get through. We've been talking about, and it's very pertinent in this area, the use of illegal labour on horticultural properties. I don't think that is a secret to anyone anymore, and yet we have a government who has failed to act. We have a government that is happy for the onus and the blame to lay squarely with the people, even though it's a system that we have to operate within. And we've done the data, and we've got the studies, and we've seen the demonstration and whatever else, but it'll come down to some other competing interests. So, for example, we need to protect national security, so we must ensure that we've got workers from the Pacific, so therefore it doesn't matter if it doesn't make sense anywhere else around the country, you have to use workers from the Pacific, and this is exactly how you have to use them, and this is exactly how much it's going to cost you, and then it becomes this unworkable system because we're being unrealistic about the reality of what's going on. But governments are worried because the first thing that happens when we say we need a visa from somewhere else is that the far right jump up and down and say, no, we don't want any immigration, and they steal Australian jobs and blah, blah, blah. So we're really reactive to those 10% that Ross mentioned. The ordinary person, the central kind of balanced kind of view doesn't actually get heard that much. So it's also a failure of the people to actually say, yeah, we acknowledge that this is what the situation is, and we're not going to react in this. We're not going to allow only the people that are the extreme views to be the ones that react and dictate public discourse.